When Red Dead Redemption 2 launched, it received unparalleled fanfare. It quickly became surrounded by more tens than the emcee in Cabaret almost immediately upon release. People became almost sycophantically obsessed with the game. It wasn't even relegated to the gaming community anymore, but expanded into regular pop culture as well. Everyone was talking about this game. And the question is, how did this happen? Why did this happen? Why does Red Dead Redemption 2 work so well for so many people? Well, I think I know, so allow me to explain. When I played the game initially, I was honestly surprised. I'm not sure what I expected, but the game was nonetheless a bit underwhelming at first. What I mean is that when you start Red Dead, you begin playing as Arthur Morgan, trudging through the snow with the rest of your gang, trying to escape the pursuing authorities. You find a place to hide out and then set up camp. Then you go back out into the snow to find your missing crewmates, and I found all of this to be a really interesting choice. You see, normally in a narrative, you want to start the story in an exciting and interesting way. You want to frame the characters around an action. That way you understand them, at least in part, from the start. I just read that out loud. I didn't mean for that to rhyme, but you know what? I'm keeping it in. This isn't to say that you should go all the way back in their story and leave nothing unshown, but rather that your first exposure to a character should be very tactical and carefully chosen. Think of the opening of Les Miserables. You see a group of prisoners pulling in a massive ship from the bay. It's cold, wet, and ruthless. You feel for the prisoners because the director and writers framed our exposure to them in this way. They also could have gone all the way back and shown us Jean Valjean stealing the loaf of bread for his sister's starving child. But they didn't. And they didn't for good reason. No one believes Jean Valjean when he says that he stole the loaf of bread to help his sister's child, primarily because no one was there. It's all conjecture, and we inevitably find ourselves trusting the man in uniform over the man down on his luck looking like Logan near the end. We aren't shown this background portion because it would make us trust Jean Valjean too early. If we feel he's done nothing wrong from the outset, his choice to quote-unquote allow another story to begin would carry no weight. What is shown is just as important as what is not. Or look at the opening for God of War. We see Kratos standing resolute on the home screen by a marked tree. Once you choose to begin the game, he swings and chops the tree down, only for you to find out that this tree was marked by Kratos' recently deceased love for her own funeral pyre. It's incredibly intimate as a moment, and we get to witness it. And it's also important to point out that this was very carefully chosen. Most people, including myself, expected the new God of War to do the obligatory massive boss fight introduction to the game, but instead, they chose to start in almost as solemn a way as possible, with a funeral. They could have opened the game with the Baldur fight, but they didn't, and they chose not to because if they did, players would subconsciously be conditioned to think that those boss fights were the game's main priority, which they were not. Now for Red Dead, the obvious opening would be to show what happened in Blackwater just before the opening sequence we get. In Blackwater, we know that there was some sort of robbery that went bad, Arthur was forced to abandon the new life that he was establishing, and Dutch killed an innocent girl. Though it's not clear how all of this transpired specifically, which is also intentional. You would think that the developers would not hesitate to show us this. It would introduce us to the characters in an exciting way, it would front-load the game with a large action sequence instead of a slow snow level, and it would introduce us to the combat mechanics very quickly. It seems like a home run, right? So then why didn't they do it? It's pretty simple, actually. For the same reason that God of War doesn't open on a boss battle, because the opening sets the tone. It establishes the tableau that the rest of the scene will play out before. If they started the game in this way, you would expect there to be constant action sequences and that the game was all about robbing, pillaging, and running from the law. Instead, the game opens on this cast of characters doing what matters most to them: protecting each other. This is what the game is all about: family. You still rob, pillage, and run from the police, but Rockstar wanted to make it clear that this was not the point of the game, even though it seems to be from an outsider's perspective. This is why it would be counterproductive to open the game in Blackwater. By starting the game in this more solemn way, players realize, rightfully or wrongly, that this gang is just trying to escape their past and move on. In fact, all Dutch can talk about is how he wants to get enough money so that he can help his, quote, family, end quote, escape to an island paradise. Everything you do in the opening hours of the game is designed to reinforce this concept. And with this foundation laid, the writers can now focus on the arcs and how the family falls apart. They can now ask key questions like, does Dutch even really care, or is he just self-interested? Is the family actually trying to move on, or are they just justifying their horrendous actions by way of falsified redemption? After all, the game is called Red Dead Redemption, and so it's safe to assume that the protagonists are trying to achieve redemption through Red Dead means, or in other words, by way of blood and death. These questions can be asked because the answers were not already given. Had we seen the gang in Blackwater, we would likely already have developed perceptions of each of the characters and would likely have answers to these questions already. This is why the game's opening is so well done, in my opinion. It sets the stage perfectly for the discussions that will be had over the course of the rest of the game. It also flips the game's chief end on its head, because when most people start the game, they are likely expecting to jump right into gunfights and robberies. After all, that is pretty much all the game was advertised with. Instead, they're met with this low fog of gloom that forces them to feel the same way that Arthur feels, as though he's trapped and being kept from doing what he should be doing, robbing and thieving. It also shows the player that they have a dichotomy to resolve. As you go through the game, you can choose to behave in a moral or immoral way, and both have their benefits. Should you play immorally, you will have bounties levied against you in various cities, making it increasingly difficult to explore the world at your own pace. You will also receive the bad ending once you reach the game's climax. If you act in a moral manner, however, you can expect everyone to view you in a positive light, and that the game's ending will reflect this as well. Now, for some, they will play however they want to in the moment in order to further their own interests. For most, however, at least according to a recent poll that I conducted, they will play in a moral way. Now, why is this the case? Well, it could be that people simply tend to behave in a moral way when they are given the choice, or the more interesting option is that people felt compelled to behave in this way. Compared to games like Grand Theft Auto 5, players act much more differently in the Wild West than they do in Los Santos, despite the fact that you would assume that people would be more misbehaved in the wild freaking West compared to a metropolitan epicenter. I would argue this is because when playing as Arthur, you understand that your actions have consequences that are far beyond that of just receiving 5 stars for a few minutes. If you screw up and run someone down on your horse, you may end up causing trouble for your whole gang. You know that robbing a train could lead the Pinkertons to you and your family, and so you try to behave in a much more appropriate fashion. This is when these games are at their best, when you're scared that your actions could come back to haunt you. This means that the player has become fully invested in the world and the consequences therein. In order to resolve this dichotomy, the player has to decide if they're going to pursue redemption for their crimes that take place before the events of the game and during the main story, or if they're going to continue living their life in as chaotic a manner as possible. Furthermore, beyond believing in moral and physical consequences for erroneous actions, part of effective world building is ensuring that there are events and people that populate it that make the world feel as though it is believable. These events can take countless forms, but a great example is when you're exploring the world and organically discover something unique and interesting. In Red Dead, this can take the form of an incestuous couple that wants to feed you dinner, like I discussed in another recent video, which will pop up in a card right about now. Or perhaps an example would be finding a Sasquatch in a cave, or a lady whose horse has collapsed and pinned her underneath. All of these are encounters, and they make the world seem real because they aren't forced upon you. They are purely results of your attentiveness and ability to explore the world effectively. Now, the big question is whether or not these things can tie together into something that makes sense and that we can use to evaluate the game as a whole. And I think they can. The reason that Red Dead Redemption 2 works so well is that the player believes in the world and cares about it at the same time. This is incredibly hard to pull off in a linear narrative title, much less an open-world exploration-based sandbox. That's only been accomplished by a couple of titles in all of video game history, and that's why Red Dead has been received the way that it has, because it is so abnormal. Games like this almost don't exist at all. In the sea of titles that we get every year, to find one that has an open world that is believable and that you care about is effectively unheard of. Players wanted to explore the world because it was worth exploring, and they wanted to live in it in the same styling as the player character because they cared about said character. We weren't just exploring a world full of collectibles and checking off boxes as we went, but rather we were exploring a world that was living and breathing, all so that we could support a family that we truly cared about. Players connected to this world and the people that populate it to a much greater and deeper extent than they had connected to a game before, or at least in a very long time. Moreover, they respected the people and the world that Rockstar built, and that is something that is truly phenomenal, and Rockstar deserves all the praise that they have received for it. That's all from me. Thank you for watching. I honestly appreciate it. These videos take a lot of work, so if you can support me by either liking it, subscribing, or sharing it with your friends, I would greatly appreciate it. I love you all, and I'll see you in the next video.